Hey, everybody. That was a super corny intro. Welcome back. I am Dr. Carly Golightly, and here for another installment of our chats with me, topics that I think are really important for the general public to know, to empower them about their health, their wellness, and to help you live longer, healthier, happier lives, right? So we've done a couple of podcasts up to this point, ranging from a lot of different topics. So we've talked a little bit about chronic disease. We've talked about what it actually means to be healthy. We've talked about dogmas of health. We've talked about what a naturopathic doctor is, which is what I am, and how we philosophically have a little bit of a different way of treating people and looking at the process of disease. So today, we're actually going to be talking about a topic that is really pertinent right now, because every single person is dealing with this COVID pandemic that we have. And one of the number one things that I am seeing coming into my office is people coming in and saying, "Doc, I am stressed. Help me out. I don't know what to do. I feel like I can't sleep. My hair's falling out. I am just struggling to either lose weight or gain weight. I just feel burnt out. I have a lack of focus. My brain is foggy all the time. What the heck is going on?" So today, our topic is all about stress, the nervous system, and your hormones. Because that's right, all of those three things play together in a very intricate balance. It's a very delicate balance between your nervous system, your endocrine system, which is where hormones come from, and stress. Basically, the reason why this is so important, so stress is what we call an extrinsic factor. This is something that happens out in the world that affects the way your body on the inside actually functions, right? So we have stress, whatever that could be. An important thing to remember here is that stress can be good as well. A stressor is defined as anything that is a change from the normal, right? So when we think of stress, we tend to think of like the negative stuff. So just to use the topic of COVID, right? So all the different changes that people are going through with COVID, with, jobs being different, kids being at home at school. But the stress can also be a good thing too. So for instance, I got engaged last week, and there's lots of good changes about to happen in my life, but that can also be a stress on the body. So when something happens on the outside world, so whether it's a change in job, change in your relationship status, something like that, your body, so your nervous system, particularly your brain, registers that and then creates a response via the endocrine system, so your hormones, to tell the rest of your body what to do. And it does that through this wonderful cycle. It's called the HPA axis. So today we're going to be going a little bit more into the details about the HPA axis. I'm going to give you guys some of the nitty-gritty science on it, but not too much. And then I'll talk a little bit about why it's important and what it looks like when it's out of balance. And that'll end this podcast. But the one following this, we're going to go ahead and talk about what you can do if you're someone who's going through a stressful time in your life. If you suspect you may have some level of dysfunction going on, some basic, really foundational tips on how you can start to rewrite the story for yourself. And I'll also give you guys a little bit of information on when you should probably seek the help of a doctor, or when it might be warranted to look a little bit deeper. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So some just basic terms real quick, right? So the HPA axis, that stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, right? That's a mouthful. What it means in a nutshell, this is how your nervous system communicates information from the outside world to the rest of your body via hormones. So hormones are just little chemical signals that float around, and they go from one place to another, and they have some kind of desired effect, right? So I gave you guys a couple examples about stuff that I've seen in my office, but I've actually have a personal story with dysfunction of this system as well. Probably not surprising to some of you guys. I had major HPA axis dysfunction when I was in my 4th year of medical school. Not really that shocking. Medical school is notorious for being a very, very stressful event in people's lives. By the time I got to that point in med school, I could not get enough sleep. I was tired all the time. My hair was falling out, which is for a woman, not such a great thing, or for a man either. Nobody likes it when their hair falls out. I was exhausted. I was having a hard time with something that we call orthostatic hypotension, which is a very fancy word for saying that you get really dizzy when you stand up. And for me, being someone who's a weightlifter, and then you go ahead and add some weight on top of that, it was just not a good combination. So all of that was really the result of my HPA axis, basically having that long-term stress going on for so long that it was affecting the way that my hormones and my nervous system were on a daily basis. Let's meet your HPA axis. So I said already that this stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Hypothalamus, let's start with that. This is the command center inside of your brain that controls your metabolism and your stress response. You can kind of consider it like the stress thermostat for your autonomic nervous system. So think autonomic means automatic. You have no control over it. It's just going to do what it wants to do. Most people are familiar now with the two parts of the autonomic nervous system. So you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The most common way to think about these two, sympathetic is fight or flight. That's when you're responding to a stressor. You can either run for it or you can fight it. And parasympathetic is when you're resting, you're digesting, all that type of stuff. So sympathetic, think stressed out. Parasympathetic, think you're laying on the beach somewhere with a margarita. That's basically the two of them. So the hypothalamus also links to your thyroid, which is at the base of your neck here, the adrenal glands, which sit just right on top of the kidneys, and the gonads via hormonal signals, right? So you can see how anytime something happens that affects the hypothalamus, all of those three things are going to be affected as well. And it does that by releasing a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH for short, much, much easier to say. And in a normal person, this works in a 24-hour cycle, right? So some of us are probably familiar with the term circadian rhythm. That just means your sleep-wake cycle. And it's a really important thing to note that all of the hormones in your body, and in fact, most of the cells inside of your body function on that 24-hour clock, which is why normal sleep cycles are so important. And it's very telling to me as a doctor when someone comes in and they're having a hard time sleeping. It tells me that something is off there. So we'll get back to that circadian rhythm piece later because it's really important. So the P in HPA axis stands for pituitary. There's actually two parts of the pituitary gland. We're only going to talk about one part of it, which is the anterior part of the pituitary. So hypothalamus, it talks to that part of the pituitary gland. And that part, the anterior part of the pituitary gland, releases something called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Another big fancy word, but it kind of tells you all right in there exactly what it's going to do. It goes to the adrenal glands, right? Interesting part to note about the pituitary gland, this anterior part in particular, is that it also makes the hormone that stimulates your thyroid. It also makes the hormones that tell whether the ovaries or the testicles how much hormone to produce. And it releases growth hormone as well. So pretty little, tiny little important part of your brain that sits right there. And it's only about the size of maybe a walnut. Kind of a big deal. So the last part of our HPA axis, the A, is the adrenal gland. So if you remember, pituitary gland secretes ACTH, and that goes through the bloodstream and travels all the way down to the kidneys. And the adrenal gland sits right on top of the kidneys. And they have actually 3 different layers in them. And all 3 of those layers have a very specific purpose. So we have a saying in medicine that goes, the deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So the first layer has the part of the adrenal glands that regulates your electrolyte levels. So it all has to do with salt balance and blood pressure. The middle layer has to do with blood sugar, stress, and immune suppression, meaning it breaks down your immune system. This is where cortisol comes from. That's that really popular hormone that everyone talks about in terms of stress, right? They say they got high cortisol, high cortisol, high cortisol. It's coming from this middle layer of the adrenal gland. And then right there in the middle, or at the very end of it, we have the part that releases sex hormones. So most people think that all sex hormones come from either the ovaries or the testes. That's not true. The adrenal glands actually make quite a bit of them as well, particularly one called DHEA, which is an androgenic hormone, meaning that it has kind of those male characteristics. An interesting thing to know for women who are going through menopause, obviously during that point in life, the ovaries stop making the estrogen and progesterone that women are familiar with in their younger years. And the adrenal glands actually take over during that time, which is why it can be kind of a rough transition, obviously, because not only are you basically taking away normal levels of hormones that a woman is used to, you're also asking another organ to kind of take over that production, and it just simply cannot keep up. So HPA access support is actually incredibly important for women during menopause. So obviously the ACTH that comes from the pituitary gland acts on that middle part where we are releasing the cortisol. So that's kind of the main focus of this podcast here today, is that part right there where we have the hypothalamus talking to the pituitary gland, talking to the adrenal glands, where cortisol is then released into the rest of the body. Now, ideally, this should work on what we call a negative feedback loop, which means that once cortisol is released and it goes out into the periphery and it does its thing, then your brain tells you to shut the whole thing off, right? And so now the cortisol is out there, it's done its thing, and the brain can kind of say, oh, you know what? Okay, we're good. We've responded to that stressor and we can go back to normal now. But what we're finding that it happens increasingly more in modern life is that people have this constant stress response again and again and again and again, which never allows them to go back to baseline. So we see these chronically higher levels of cortisol, which can have an effect on the way that your body functions. So let's talk a little bit about the different causes of why you might have these chronic stressors going on in your life, why this matters really, right? Most of us know that their life can be stressful at times, right? There's no perfect way to go throughout this. In fact, I think it would actually be really boring if life were not stressful. So stress in any form is something that can cause this whole feedback loop to happen. A note that I like to say is, so a lot of people will talk about this and just say that they have adrenal fatigue. It's not really, it's kind of a misnomer for what's happening here. You have to look for the cause of what's going on, right? Which means you have to identify the particular stressor. So I just want to take a moment to talk about some of those things that could be that stressor. Obviously, we have the mental and emotional piece of things. One of these things is you can have stressful relationships. You can have something called adverse childhood events. There's actually been really interesting research showing that events that happen in childhood can modulate the way that the nervous system sees the rest of the world in such a way that even a small thing that normally wouldn't stress out an adult would stress out someone who has been through something tough in their childhood. And then also there's stress from just general demands of life, the general running around, trying to make a living, trying to support a family, and also just a sense of a lack of purpose too can be a really stressful thing. So those are our mental and emotional stressors. Next, we have physical stressors, right? So these are the things that something is actually physically happening to your body. Things like a traumatic brain injury, which makes sense because we know that two pieces of that HPA axis actually live inside of the brain. So people that have TBIs and then, say, for example, a veteran or a sports player who ends up having some kind of brain injury and then all of a sudden they can't sleep at night and their mood's different and all these type of things, it's coming from the fact that this whole process has been changed. Chronic pain is another thing that can alter the HPA axis, as well as chronic illnesses. Anything like autoimmune diseases, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, allergies, even. These are all really common things, and the HPA axis can be absolutely affected by it. We also have environmental toxins. So something that people we typically tend to skip over a lot of times is, are people getting clean food, clean water? Are their pharmaceuticals and their supplements high quality? Are they things that we can make sure are not causing some kind of toxic burden inside of a body? And then there's also chronic sleep deprivation, which is a big one, because I can't even tell you how many patients I've had come into my office. They say, you know what, doc, I'm fine off of 4 hours of sleep. I'm totally fine, which actually may seem true to them. But there is really great research out there by Matthew Walker, who's a PhD, and his whole body of research has been focused on sleep science. And what they found, interestingly, is that sleep deprivation causes a similar effect to drinking alcohol. So, that kind of inhibition, that inhibitory feeling that you get when you drink alcohol, where you don't really have a real idea of what you're capable of. And you think like, oh yeah, totally, I'm good to drive, I can do this. It's the same thing with sleep, actually. So chronic sleep deprivation will make you think that you're fine, when in fact, your ability to cognitively exist in the real world and function optimally is very, very impaired. And it also messes up your hormones too. So it causes an increase of cortisol, which makes you store fat and it breaks down your muscle. It causes an increase of insulin, which again stores fat. It increases ghrelin, which means you feel hunger more. It means you eat more. People are actually more likely to overeat on the days that they haven't gotten enough sleep. It decreases a hormone called leptin, which is the satiety. This is the hormone that makes you feel like you're full. And then human growth hormone decreases as well. So human growth hormone is actually pulsed at night most potently. So this is why sleep is so important for like exercise recovery and things like that. Without it, you don't get that human growth hormone increase that you need to recover and build new tissues. And then the last piece here is the inflammatory piece of things. So this could be kind of considered a physical stress, but I wanted to put it into a different category because there are a couple things here that I think are worth talking about. So number one being birth control. So many women are on birth control for one reason or another. And these hormones, because of the fact that they're not the same as the hormones that your body naturally produces, and you have them in what we call supraphysiological amounts, meaning we have way more of them than you would naturally get, it can cause an inflammatory reaction inside of the body. Diet choices too. That's another really big one. So it's things that can cause that. The two main ones that I see are eating low quality foods. So this is, your processed, packaged, those kinds of foods. And then stress eating too. So if you're the type of person that's constantly eating on the go, you're not stopping to really just think and enjoy your meal and just be present with that, that can also cause a lot of inflammatory response inside of the body and disrupt this HPA axis. And the last thing is overtraining. I've personally done this to myself a couple times actually, and I know a lot of people who have done it too, especially for this type of crowd. So the type A personality is one who is absolutely prone to doing things like overtraining, not sleeping enough, and then disrupting the HPA axis by proxy of doing all of those things. So take a sip of water real quick. So what happens if you disrupt your HPA axis and it's now dysfunctional? Because the hormones from this HPA axis literally touch every single cell in the body, the effects are widespread. So you can imagine if every single cell is affected in a different way, it seems like it's going to have this really crazy effect on your body, and it might be kind of hard to pin down exactly what's happening. So I'll go ahead and just kind of ramble off some of the things that might happen to someone who has HPA axis dysfunction, and the things that I'm looking for as a practitioner to clue me in that this is where we need to start. So changes in blood pressure. We talked about the adrenal glands, and part of the adrenal glands being responsible for at modulating the amount of electrolytes inside of your blood and also partially your blood pressure. Blood sugar regulation. So one of the things that happens when you're stressed out is that registers this signal to bring more glucose into your blood so that you could take it to the muscle tissue and have the ability to use that energy to run or fight or whatever. Mood changes are another big piece of things. We talked about a lot of this being present, a lot of this happening inside of the brain. So it makes sense that mood changes would be part of it, particularly depression and anxiety. Whenever I see a patient, specifically one with anxiety, I do immediately start thinking about HPA axis. Energy levels are another piece that are really related to this. Chronic fatigue syndrome in particular, which is a diagnosis that was kind of pushed off for a while, but is now becoming more and more common. And these are just people who are tired all the time and they can't figure out why. It can be related to issues with cortisol. Insomnia, obviously, I mentioned that a couple times. The ability to get a good night's sleep. So not only difficulty falling asleep, but difficulty staying asleep, not feeling well rested when you wake up in the morning. All of these things can be signs of that. Any hormonal imbalance, particularly something with the thyroid or the sex hormones. So if you're someone who has really, you've been getting more progressively worse thyroid levels, HPA axis might be something to consider. Even like PMS or those types of symptoms. Low testosterone for men is another one where I think of the HPA axis as well. Because all of those three hormones, so the cortisol, the thyroid hormone, and the sex hormones, they all play together in a very tight-knit role. Any extreme weight changes, either extreme weight gain or weight loss, can be related to this. Worsening allergies because of the fact that that cortisol actually will suppress the immune system, and digestive disorders as well. Another really interesting point that I found during my research for this podcast was that HPA axis, now that it is becoming something that people are more commonly interested in, they're finding these associations with it. So with pretty severe diseases where HPA axis dysfunction is present and may be one of the contributing factors in causing it. So things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and Huntington's disease, which are these really complex neuroendocrine disorders, HPA axis dysfunction is a big piece of how they develop and what makes them worse. So that was a lot of information. So we're going to go ahead and leave that here for this podcast. I'm going to give you guys some time to stew over all of that and really understand all those different pieces. And in our next installment, we're going to go ahead and talk about what you can do about it if you think that you're someone who might be struggling with an HPA axis issue. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.